Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'd make that 10 o'clock by the clock on my computer screen. Firstly, welcome to this webinar that we're hosting this morning on the psychology of phishing. My name is Sandy Kirkpatrick. I'm one of the account managers here in the chamber that work within the account management team. I cover the majority of the Thames Valley, but mainly focused on Buckinghamshire, Oxford, and Slough and Windsor. I will quickly introduce our speaker this morning, Mark Brown, who is the founder of Psybersafe. Mark has over 25 years worth of experience in technology and for financial institutions. And in 2019, about 3 years ago, he founded Psybersafe, which is a cybersecurity company focusing not just on the technology of cybersecurity, but also on the psychology. And Mark is a firm believer in behavioural science, and he will delve into more of that as we go along this morning. Without further ado, I won't steal any of Mark's thunder, and I'll hand over to him to get on this morning's webinar. Before I do, I'll just quickly say that the chat box is open. It's designed to be an interactive webinar this morning, so please feel free to raise your hand or to ask questions. Put your questions in the chat box below, and Mark can pick up on those either as he's talking or if he feels so towards the end of the presentation. But without further ado, Mark, I will hand over to you. Good morning.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. I will remove my enormous face from the screen and calm things down a little bit. Indeed, this morning, we're going to look at the psychology of phishing. We tend to focus a lot on the technicalities, look out for spelling mistakes and such, which is all very good, but really what's interesting is what is under the hood. In other words, going on in our brains as we get these sorts of emails in. As Sandy said, by all means, I'll try and ask a few questions here and there. If you can raise your hand like that, or thumbs up, or whatever it is, if you acknowledge what I'm saying, that'd be great. Little bit about me. Indeed, we set up Psybersafe in 2019 after a number of years building, if you like, version 1 within a bank. But it's not banking, so we decided to set this up separately. My focus is psychology, and specifically how we apply that in the cybersecurity world, because we tend to forget about the fact that we're actually human. And certainly when it comes to phishing, the phishers or cyber criminals don't forget this. In fact, this is exactly what they're playing on. And I expect you'll probably see quite a lot of this, or recognize quite a lot of what I might show you. So I think that's enough about me. Let's talk about the psychology of phishing. Now, essentially, I will use this one image. But as you can see, I've broken it down because it's very, very busy. And in part, that's because it is very complex, because there are so many psychological phenomena that are playing and that are being played. We have to move back and forth between the psychology and how we see how that is applied in reality. So this is not about training for phishing, this particular presentation. This really is about looking how psychology actually affects us every single day. However, my business is training using behavioural science. Really, this is how we should be training people. A lot of cybersecurity is around behaviour, how you and I act, and we tend to throw information at people and expect things to change, which just doesn't work. And hopefully what I'll be able to show you is why that often doesn't work, because there's a lot going on under the hood, or in the brain, if you like. So from there, let's focus and look at the psychology elements first of all, and then we'll look at how we see that in some mail examples going forward. First and foremost, it's worth recognizing that phishing is actually these days a career choice. Problem is that it is far too easy and cheap to instigate a phishing campaign. And these days, we talk about hacking as a service. So if I would want to start a phishing campaign, either to get some money from unsuspecting people or data, I can actually pay somebody to set that up for me. I can pay them to deliver the emails to a target group. I can pay somebody to find me a target group. I can pay somebody to put in the malicious code or the link or whatever it is that I might want in there. And the chances of you catching me are zero. Not only will I be sitting behind a whole series of servers in another jurisdiction, whether that's Russia or China or somewhere in the East or South America or anywhere, arguably. As I think we may have seen in the press here, there's a lot of talk about how the police simply isn't set up to do an awful lot about online fraud. Totally understaffed, and it seems to be an almost invisible crime. So it's a career choice, which means that there's a lot of stuff going on without any care in the world. Secondly, and this is arguably the biggest motivator as to why we should be paying attention to this, but why often we don't, is that most people don't see themselves as a target, which means that you are an unsuspecting victim. Thing is, you are an unsuspecting target. You are a valued target. We all have something of interest, whether that is money, data, access to networks. So when people say, oh, well, I'm not rich, or I'm not a CEO, or I'm not a big organization, from a hacking perspective, I don't care. If I'm looking for trying to swindle people out of a bit of cash, if I send out 10,000 emails and 100 people actually click and drop £10 in somewhere, or sometimes don't even notice, thank you very much, it's paid for itself. But if what you have isn't very interesting, you may well give me access to your company network, for example. Or if not, I can get into your contacts and all of a sudden I've got a way into people you know, and I could pretend I'm you, for example. So the notion that you're not a target is fundamentally wrong. You, as I said, you have money, you have data, or you have access to data that I can exploit. And once we realize that, maybe we start paying a little bit more attention to what's actually coming in. Then, if we're talking about phishing, we can actually chop up what goes on in phishing emails in 8 different psychological phenomena. And I've put them here, and we'll go through them one by one. And you will recognize these as we go through them. But as much as we understand this stuff, clearly cyber criminals understand this as well and exploit it. You'll also notice that a lot of this you'll recognize from advertising and marketing, funnily enough, because there, of course, it's a similar game in that they are trying to persuade us to do something, principally buy their stuff. What a phisher or hacker tries to do is persuade you to click on something or open something and then move on from there. So let's have a look at how these come across and why this is so particularly successful, apart from the fact that it's cheap and easy to do. We continue to fall for this stuff. And we may say, oh, yeah, not me. And they'll be true until it does happen to you. And it certainly happened to me as well. Perhaps maybe you can raise your hand. Well, first of all, do you recognize, do you get phishing mails coming into your email box? Perhaps you can raise your hand if you do. And I expect most of you will. And similarly, I wonder if anybody's actually been a victim of phishing mails. So I'm going to lower my hand and I'm going to raise it again because I think I have, funnily enough, some years ago, very clever mail that convinced me to send them some money for something I thought I owed. I'm still not convinced that it was actually something that I did owe, but there you go. But let's have a look then. First of all, as you can see here at the top, I mentioned something called normality. I apologize for the term. But what I mean here is the normality or the banality of us using email. We all use it, we all look at it every day. It is now the most common form of communication in the workplace. So we accept that we get mails that sit there in the morning, mails from people we don't know, about subjects that we may not be expecting. That's normal. Now, if this was a stranger walking into our living room saying, hey, hello, you don't know me, but we'd have something to say about it. Yet, for some reason, you get an email from a total stranger asking you for your time or to read whatever they've written. We accept that. And similarly, how many of us have more than one email account? I imagine probably most of us. I certainly do. I will raise my hand. I have, actually 4. One I use just for spam, for example. However, I look at it and sometimes that's quite interesting. So normality is a thing. Also, in each of these emails, we see links and attachments. And for 20 years, we've been told, oh, here's a link, click on it. So that's what we do. And unfortunately, quite often without really thinking through what might be behind that link. So the behavior of dealing with email and how we deal with email is completely ingrained in all of us. And actually from a phishing education perspective, is to cut that behavior and have people actually stop and think about what it is that they're seeing. So normality plays a big part. It is actually the biggest attack vector, if you like, used by cyber criminals more than anything else. Now, I'm sure you'll recognize this. We know that there are some things that every phishing email will do, which is to hide the true intentions, of course. They'll hide where it's coming from, they'll pretend to be somebody else, and clearly they will hide the intention. The intention is to defraud you in some way, shape, or form. I'm not going to advertise that, of course. So I make these things look very realistic. And also, it's quite easy these days to spoof, to fake where this is coming from. So it could even say it's coming from me when actually it might be somebody else pretending to be me. And certainly if somebody else has hacked into your friend's email box, for example, that makes it even easier. And this happens a lot. So phishing emails these days are not what they used to be, full of spelling mistakes and bad fonts and things not really looking correct, because it's become, as I mentioned earlier, a very sophisticated industry. And they will all try to pass themselves off as something else and hide the maliciousness of whether it's code or whether it's a link to a equally fake but convincing website, for example. We see that everywhere. Then, and again, I expect you to see emails like this. Urgency plays a huge part. Now we know this, and we warn people, if a mail looks urgent, hold on a second, wait, and just check where this is coming from. But what does urgency actually do to us? We react to urgency in a way that we would have done in our prehistoric days. So we talk about the lizard brain, which is that part of the brain that evolved very early on in our evolution. Centered around the amygdala, which is a small sort of walnut in the center of our brain. It is in charge of our fight, flight, or freeze response if we sense danger. And as an aside, because it is so primordial, if you like, it's also in charge of feeding, fear, and fornication. Forgive me for the word, but these are prime urges, if you like. So the lizard brain will create stress. Now, in the old days, of course, if you're wandering through the forests or the jungle and you hear a rustling, you cannot hang around, but you have to react very quickly to what is potentially a danger. And in order to do that, it's fight or flight. Now, urgency creates that same sort of response. Clearly, it's not life or death, but we have similar reactions. And what happens when we have increased stress levels is blood will move to our extremities, ready for fight or flight, which means cognitively, we're not as alert and capable as otherwise we might be. So urgency can cause a little bit of stress. And under stress, and there's plenty of research on this, we perform tasks less well. And so you can see that when we see something that is urgent, we may not be paying as much attention as we ought to be. On urgency, we also know, for example, that we tend to prioritize things that are time sensitive as opposed to being super important. So we tend to focus on things that are urgent. Again, we get that sort of tunnel vision. So urgency creates a nice little, from a hacking perspective, sense of, oh my God, I better do something. And we stop evaluating as well as we should. This is why urgency is an effective tool. And here's an example. You may have seen this. You may use PayPal or not, but we see this in quite a number of phishing attacks. There's some other things going on here that we'll unpack in a minute. But here, this creates some sense of urgency. And if you do have a PayPal account, or you've got 24 hours before your account is disabled, then you may have some money in there. Or you may not be sure if you still have money in there. You think, hey, what's going on? So click, I want to confirm my information. It's very easily done. And that's another part of the problem. It's so easily done that we just do it in a potentially a slight sense of panic. So it's a very powerful psychological phenomenon. And we see that under the item that lure us into doing something. The sense of urgency, coupled in that previous example with a threatening language, will lure us in, will drag us into to go and do something. Second one that's very, very powerful is curiosity. Curiosity killed the cat, I suppose, is the saying, but it can also take all your data and money away. It's an interesting one. There's not a huge amount of psychology research on curiosity, but what I did find is very relevant. Curiosity is the driver for a search for information experience. It motivates exploration. And of course, it plays a huge role in education and the way that we learn from babies onwards. It prompts a connection with decision-making, and specifically risky decision-making. Curiosity motivates us, as Lowenstein said in a paper in 1994. He pinpointed what he called the information gap. So the discrepancy between our current knowledge state and the level of knowledge that we want to attain. It's a direct cause of curiosity. Now, what is interesting is this is ridiculously powerful. I've run quite a number of phishing campaigns in large organizations, literally with thousands and thousands of people repeatedly. And we analyze what happens, and then we ask people, why did you click on what is reasonably obviously a dodgy email? And I've literally had the response, oh, I was curious. And in another case, the response, yes, it looked dodgy, but I'll just have a look. So even if we think this is potentially hazardous, we will still have a look. And this is not limited to email, of course. You hear of people, looking over a cliff edge and then falling off. So curiosity can drag us into places that we really don't want to be. So again, it is a lure to entice us to do what I want you to do in that email. And there might be all kinds of things. Hey, here's a special offer. Or have a look at this silly video, for example. or as you'll see later on. Here's some information on COVID, which of course during COVID times is very relevant. So be aware of curtailing curiosity. That is coupled with the notion of fear of loss. Now, as humans, losses loom larger in our minds than gains. Now, this is something that, and you may be familiar with Daniel Kahneman, a psychologist who won the Nobel Prize for Economics. He wrote a fantastic book, Thinking Fast and Slow. If you haven't come across it, I recommend it to everybody when I talk about it. It really looks at the way that our brain actually helps us or makes us make decisions, as opposed to how an economist might think of us as being very rational human beings. Fundamentally, we're not. And the decisions we make are influenced by an awful lot of external factors that we're simply not aware of. One of them is this, which is the asymmetry between the power of positive and negative expectations. And again, this makes sense because, you know, let's go back to our loincloths in the jungle or the forests. We treat threats more urgently than opportunities, which of course gives us a better chance to survive and reproduce. So again, we focus on the threat and we try and avoid threats and we try and avoid loss. So messages that say, if you don't act, you will be fined, or you will lose out, or you will not be able to participate, are very, very strong. And again, these are terms that you'll recognize from advertising campaigns and marketing activities, of course. And criminals will use them in their phishing mails. Now, this is quite an interesting one. Here, your car has been caught in, I think it's the wrong zone, or something like that. It threatens you with a £50 fine and £100 if you don't respond at all. So now you're looking at, oh my God, I could lose £100. But it then tells you that it will be dropped to £25, your £50 fine, if you pay it within 14 days. And you get this, I'm sure you've had it, you know, from some of these parking companies, oh, £60 fine. If you pay within 14 days, it'll be, I don't know, 30 or 40 pounds. Which tends to work. The hassle of otherwise contesting, etc., etc. You focus on the fact that, hey, you only have to pay 25 rather than 50. So you forget that actually, you know, they're holding you up for 50. You're happy to pay the 25. Now, if you look at this image carefully, it's actually a very poor email. It's poorly written. Also, at the bottom, the one way of trying to contest this is a phone number, and behind it, it says temporarily unavailable. So all your avenues are gone. So at the risk of losing 100, you'd rather pay the 25. And that can be quite effective. So fear of loss looms large. Now that is a number of features that it shows here. One, it creates that sense of urgency. It has the threatening language. And in the case of this one, you know, purportedly came from the government. And so it pretends to be somebody in authority, equally somebody you can trust. And, you know, as it says here, they will spoof, they will fake the way things look, they will create very realistic logos and such, all to put pressure on you to act and act quickly. So that's fear of loss, which you'll see there on the right. And that's fairly closely linked to the fear of losing out, but the fear of losing out is slightly different. This is where you might lose something that you think you already own. I use that as an example. And similarly, the fear of loss, again, Daniel Kahneman points out that we value what we own much more than what we don't own, even if it is exactly the same thing. So there were experiments done where you were given a mug and somebody would have to buy it off you, or somebody else had a mug and you buy it off them, and you would actually value them very, very differently. So in this case, you have a package and it was scheduled for delivery, but wasn't delivered, and you better chase it and in order to get it. Now, you may not have, and in this case, clearly haven't ordered a package. And I appreciate, certainly, I see this with my daughters, they sometimes forget what they've ordered. But even if you haven't ordered anything, hey, I didn't order it. The concern is that, oh, but maybe you did, or maybe this is yours. So you need to click on that manage delivery link to see what's going on. And a number of things can happen. Either you download some malicious code, or it'll take you to a FedEx website that looks exactly like the real thing, and you're asked to input some information, which I can then use to, whether it's steal or know a little bit too much about you. So the fear of losing out, again, is a powerful trigger. And again, they use the similar techniques of pretending to be somebody or something that you know and are comfortable with, and it threatens you with a loss. And all of these are also linked to the concern over consequences. What happens if I don't do this? And you saw that in a couple of examples. You either get a larger fine if you don't act, you might lose your package. This looms, again, large in what goes on from a phishing perspective. Here's the example that I showed you earlier. The notion that something bad will happen if you don't act is a very powerful force. And we see this also a lot with fraudsters coming along and pretending to be your bank, or emails asking you to click to contact your bank because something's gone wrong. That concern over the consequences, or the fear of loss or losing out, can be very powerful. And we try to remind people that you must contact your bank directly rather than through any link or any phone number that you're given, because there'll be somebody else sitting behind that. Here's another example for you. Now, many people will have BT as a provider, and this is a phishing mail, and see how realistic this looks. Now, if you're a BT customer, you think, well, I'm paying however much every month for this, I don't want to lose out, I'll just check my data, as I've asked you to do here. Whatever you click on in this mail would have guided you to their fake website that looks exactly like this. It's all too easy to get official logos and such off the internet and create websites like these. And companies such as this, or banks, spend hours and hours constantly taking down fake websites. It's a day task for some people. And the bank I was doing some consulting at until recently would literally take down thousands over the year. Like I said, it's big business. This idea of pretending to be somebody in authority or somebody you can trust plays out very, very strongly on an email. Principally because we like to, well, we have a tendency to trust, even though that may not seem that way. And we have a tendency to want to be agreeable and helpful and responsible, because this is how most people like to see themselves. Then, the final direct one, almost, is flattery. And I find this one quite amusing, because, as Mae West said, flattery will get you everywhere. And in actual fact, research shows that it's pretty true. Now, people generally tend to like those who flatter them. Oh, I'm not susceptible to this, but we all are. You know, we do like compliments and being appreciated, whether that's for what we do, or, you know, I don't know, the nice shirt that Sandy's wearing, for example. So a lot of research has been done on this, actually. And for example, a chap called Gordon, back in 1996, he found directly that people form far more favorable impressions of somebody who's flattering them when it's directed directly towards them, as opposed to watching somebody flatter somebody else. Interestingly, we think that if there is a clear ulterior motive, that we won't be so susceptible to flattery. So imagine you're looking to buy a second-hand car, and I apologize to any second-hand car salesman, but when he or she is trying to get you to buy his or her car, you can imagine the stereotypical second-hand car salesman to be very obsequious and flattering, and oh, you're wonderful, etc., etc. And you think, oh, shut up, I know why you're doing all this. However, research shows that even in situations where there's a clear ulterior motive, insincere flattery actually works. Maybe not as much as hearing it from a friend, but it does put you in a, let's call it a positive mood towards the flatterer, which I suspect most of us wouldn't like to admit, which is why the research is especially interesting, because it does show that it does work. And we see this also in phishing emails. So here's one for a Facebook user. Now, this one is a little bit dated, but it's an interesting example, because this is clearly flattery, where it says, oh, your fan page is a really good one, and you qualify for our special program, but you have to act very quickly, and otherwise you will lose your fan page. So there's a number of things going on. First of all, there's a bit of flattery going on, and then we start to see the other phenomenon come through. Creates a sense of urgency, and it creates a fear of loss, and or a concern for consequences. And then you're asked to click on a link to complete the process. And you can guess what happens. That link goes anywhere but to your Facebook page. So flattery, again, a subtle way of putting you in the right frame of mind. So that's a whole bunch of phenomena that are linked to directly what we see in phishing emails. But that's not all. Because what research shows, and what my experience also shows, is that actually principally, apart from these specific factors, where things are a limited time offer, they're made urgent, the language is threatening, or the offer is great, and arguably too good to be true, or you are particularly special, as in the case of flattery, and the sophisticated emails, there's one thing that tends to override all of this when I look at the statistics of the phishing tests and campaigns that we've run, and that is context, which we'll talk about. So here's an email. This one is by the World Health Organization. And you can see the typical things that a phishing campaign might warn you about, saying, hey, look out at who is sending this. Look for spelling mistakes, look for changes in fonts and formatting and what have you. But the problem is that criminals have become a lot more sophisticated than this. Now, if you do, and you should look out for these, of course, we use an acronym called SLAM, signature, link, address, and message. So look at who signs this thing. And in this case, that's very vague. Is it asking you to click on links or attachments? Who's this from? What is the address? And then finally, does this message actually make sense? And in this case, it doesn't chime with where this is coming from. Those are the technicalities. The problem is all of that. And what we see in, I'll give you an example, one phishing COVID at a large organization. The previous phishing campaign was something relatively, it had been a spa voucher or whatever it was. It had a click ratio of about 6 to 8%. So not many people actually fell for it. We then put out a phishing email to do with COVID, and the click ratio went up to 33%. And the reason for this is simply context. This is something that was relevant for most people, There was an awful lot of messaging going on at the time. Obviously, this was during the time of the first lockdown around COVID, that we tend to forget everything else. And it exacerbates or puts on steroids, if you like, all the other features that we've just talked about. So your curiosity is heightened. Your concern over consequences is heightened. There's always that sense of urgency. And yeah, we are just, frankly, curious about what all this is about. And this is playing, of course, every day in the press. Google actually reported that they saw an increase in phishing emails that they caught of 600% over this period. And as you can see here, this looks like a dodgy email. You know, the previous one already showed it. It says in here, this little measure can save you. It's not something that the World Health Organization would say, but we miss that because all of a sudden it's about something that is very relevant for us. And so aligning these messages to context is a very clever way of actually catching a lot of people. We see this happen at Christmas. We see it happen, for example, around Black Friday. And this is why the warnings do come out for the National Cybersecurity Center, because it gets wrapped up in the whole story. Similarly, around Valentine's Day, Easter, all these are wonderful things to use as a hacker to hide amongst the method of everything, or the messages that come out during that period. So it's very, very difficult to guard against because the context will sweep us along. So that's why it's so complicated. That's why it's difficult to guard against and something to always be aware of. And really by pulling this apart and seeing, okay, this is how we as humans will react to these mails. Hopefully, we might get a better way of actually training people so that we recognize the feelings that we see when we see these mails. And actually remember that ultimately there are humans at the end of this, and we need to focus on how we actually think and act in reality. So with all that, any questions?
Thank you very much for that, Mark. There's a couple that have come through. I think from a personal point of view, I always find the HMRC ones are particularly convincing. Any emails, I've even had a couple of phone calls from people pretending to be HMRC, any sort of finance, VAT related sort of queries, and they are incredibly, incredibly convincing. What do you do if you do click and you go through and you realize that you shouldn't have clicked on it, but what do you do in that circumstance?
If you're within an office or your company, first thing to do is contact your security or IT team immediately. Time is of the essence. Secondly, if you're at home and you're on a network, get off the network. So break that connection. So whatever is maybe on your computer doesn't go anywhere else. Don't switch off your computer because it can actually make things worse. So you leave your computer on, but you take it off the network to prevent anything spreading any further. Certainly don't respond to any emails. Don't click any further. And then it really depends on what the nature of the phishing email is. So if it was something related to your credit card, your bank, immediately, of course, contact them. And most of us will have been in touch with fraud teams as they block your credit card for paying for something. But those teams tend to be very helpful. And yeah, like I say, it depends then on what it is that's happened. If they've breached one of your accounts, change the password, change other passwords. Unfortunately, a lot of people still tend to reuse their passwords. You should have a unique password for everything else, for each account, of course. So change them all. Then scan, if you're at home, scan your laptop or your PC for viruses, hopefully with your antivirus that you have. And that should pretty much cover most of it. If you're really worried, or if you are stuck and there's a big thing on your laptop saying, oh, you've been hacked, yeah, go through all that, but then you'll need to contact a professional to try and keep your data. Here's one thing that we always tell people: you must have a backup of your computer or your laptop or your data, and that backup should be disconnected most of the time, except for when you actually do a backup, so that if your computer is attacked by ransomware, then you've got your data backed up.
Does that include in the cloud? Would that be sufficient?
No, it's not really sufficient. Yes, it's good, and for most purposes, it'll be fine. But if I'm in your laptop and you've got that connection to the cloud, I may well already be in there. Sophisticated, sophisticated attackers with ransomware, they tend to or try to get into your laptop or your computer or your network and sit there quietly and have a look around. That they will find your backups, and first thing they'll do is block those, because the value for them is in the fact that you can't access your data.
Yeah.
Make sure you have that data separately. It's the only way to recover from a ransomware attack.
Cool. Another question that's come in medium-stroke large organizations, is it ever possible to reduce the weakness created by humans? So therefore, is filtering and security to attack, the filtering and security to attacks the more effective solution? Can you see that on your screen, Mark?
Yes, I can. Okay. From Andy. It's a good question, Andy. Fundamentally, the answer is no. The problem is, yes, you could log. The only way to be sure is to get off the grid. And of course, we can't act that way anymore because everything is online. And you can lock down as much as you possibly can, but that has consequences. And I've seen this also in the school I'm working with. If you lock down too much, what do? People start finding ways around it. And what you see is people sending, for example, business or institution or school emails to their own email and going from there. Personal email systems are always less secure. Or they start doing a lot of work from their own email and their own laptop and their own hard drives and what have you. And then suddenly you find a lot of potentially sensitive data sitting all over the shop. You have no more control over data. Because fundamentally, as humans, we want the easy way. We will always look for the easy way out. And you see that when certainly established institutions tend to force us to do things with old programs and old applications. Users will very quickly find easier ways to do it, which of course then are less secure. One example, for example, is Microsoft has a way of transferring files, secure file sharing. It's not very user-friendly. The alternative that you can get online and do free is something called WeTransfer, which is super simple to use. The problem with it is that it is considered not very secure, certainly not in the financial services world. So we don't want people to do that. So you can start locking everything down, but the more you lock things down, people will try and find ways around it because they want their life to be easy. I've got my job. Last thing I want to do is spend hours trying to send a file to somebody. So fundamentally, as you hint at, and as Nick always says, cultural awareness is key. I'd layer that up a little bit and say, no, you have to focus on human behavior and start with how do people act? How do I want them to act? And build your systems around it. And that user-focused, that user-centric design is becoming more and more of a thing. But still, most of us are surrounded by systems built on technology as opposed to on how you as an individual actually could or would want to work. So you have to, and arguably, it's a win-win. You have to get your people to be part of the solution. They have to be aware, they have to understand how they can secure themselves in the organization, and also, importantly, know what to do and how to do it. that's arguably the best way to be safe. And yes, you can lock up around it, create firewalls and filters to avoid dodgy emails coming through. But the problem fundamentally is that cyber criminals only have to find one, whereas we have to make sure we've got everything papered over. And that's always going to be playing against us. So make sure your people are aware and know what they should be doing.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Mark, and as Nick said, it is a cultural awareness thing there as well.
Yeah.
Sue's given us a question. It says, is there a difference in consequences if someone clicks on a link in an email from their smartphone or on their PC/laptop?
No, only insofar as what it is that they can access. So we talk about phishing. We've also got smishing, which is phishing via SMS. There's also vishing, which is people calling you and defrauding you, and quishing, which is a bit belabored, but that's the idea of phishing through a QR code. Phishing can take several ways of doing it. Either it is a link that will download some malicious code onto your device, let's call it that. And we've seen that work both on laptops, PCs, and on phones. One example on the phone is, for example, and this happened to my daughter. She got sent an SMS, and it was some sort of app that they could download to play some sort of game. She would have been about 16, I should think. And after a number of months, she noticed that there were amounts being deducted from her bank via Apple. And it turned out that this thing had effectively downloaded something onto her phone that was a subscription. And these were very clever little amounts, £9.46, £6.47, £10 something, every month over a period of 6 months. So that can easily happen. Apple, by the way, were very good and reimbursed us the whole lot. The other thing is, if there's something on your phone and I then log on to your home network or your business network, what is there to stop this crawling into that network? So one type of malware is a worm, which is a self-contained program that will worm its way through. So yeah, no, a phone is also a port of entry. The other thing I think is worth noting here is that for the longest time we thought, well, Microsoft and PCs are far more vulnerable than Apple. Apple is safe. For a long time, it was a lot safer than Microsoft, largely because it only was a small percentage of the total population of hardware that was out there and therefore operating systems. But again, hackers aren't stupid, and more people are using Apple products, so their focus is also on Apple products. So just because you have an Apple phone or laptop or tablet doesn't mean to say that you are immune to this at all. So the only difference in consequences is really what can I reach coming in via your phone rather than via your laptop. Don't forget, if I get into your mail on your phone, that means I'm in your mail, wherever you access it. Actually, I can see these questions. You say, if one of your computers has an infection, can this spread over your Wi-Fi to other computers on your home network? Yes, absolutely it can. And unfortunately, your home network will be nowhere near as secure as that of an organization. And organizations get this happening quite a lot. The one thing that might protect to some extent is that it can be quite a bit of work, and so you're less likely as a hacker to target an individual home as you are an organization, because there's more to be gotten out of an organization. Ransomware threats of millions and millions of pounds or dollars, for example. However, as we said right in the beginning, that alone is not a defense. Simply hoping that you will hide amongst the herd, not at all. Because, for example, phishing emails are way too easy to send out there. So yes, things can spread. So it's good to know what you have on that network, and yeah, make sure that you have that protection on each device. Absolutely.
Is there any group of people that are more vulnerable to phishing, Mark, or is it the same across the board?
It isn't the same. The vulnerabilities are different. Generalizing, and this question you get quite a lot, we think, well, older people must be more vulnerable. And there is an element of that in terms of being comfortable with the technology, which actually means that we find them a lot less on social media, for example. The other side of it is that, you know, in some cases, certainly older, and I see this also with my family, they're more easily flummoxed. But interestingly, research shows that our personalities do adapt over time. And actually, as we get older, we tend to become more agreeable, which actually means we're more eager to help and please. It's generalization, but you can see how people are more likely to respond to a supposed bank request, for example. And certainly what you see in the press is a lot more about older people being hoodwinked. Other than that, which is a generalization, I must say, and I think the statistics actually bear out that whilst less targeted, perhaps slightly more easily defrauded. Interesting, some of the research we've done with companies shows that, contrary to expectations, and this surprised us when we first saw it, and now we expect it, IT people and people who work in the cybersecurity world are no more secure in their behavior than you or I, whereas you think they would be. There are certain things that they are very good at, so password management, using password managers, for example. But in terms of the way that they act in social media, online, moving data around, they really show no better behavior than we do. The other thing is that people who have been hacked before or have been a victim of cybercrime, again, surprisingly, are no better in their behaviors than you or me might be if we've never been hacked. And that puzzles us for a while, but then I think it's because experiences fade. And if it's not constantly reiterated, which is another point about training, if it's not constantly reiterated, we forget. I imagine that most of us here may be driving or have driven a car over our lifetimes and had a little prang here and there. I know I have. You don't step into the car now and think, oh my God, I'm on the road, I'm scared. You know, those experiences fade. The availability of that memory disappears in amongst everything else that goes on in life. And it's a similar thing with having been hacked. Give it a year or so and we revert back to our old ingrained behaviors. So to say, well, this group is particularly vulnerable is, there's no research that actually says, yes, it is this lot. That has to be particularly careful.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Mark. I think as Nick has mentioned in the comments section, the cyber training should focus on the person and not just the organisation, which I think is a very valid point to finish on. We're just coming up to the hour. If there's no more questions, then I will once again say thank you to everyone for coming on the session this morning. I'm sure, and I hope it's been informative. And thanks also, big thanks to Mark for presenting and for fielding all the questions so well. So thank you all very much to everyone, and I hope you have a pleasant day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.